I'll never forget that Saturday night. I was working at a community health center in the sprawling Cape Town township of Khayelitsha. I was on call, and typically for a Saturday night, it was hectic. I worked with another doctor, and together we saw dozens of patients through the course of the night. Most of them were drunk and injured in some way. Most of these injuries weren't very serious. There were stabbings, beatings, some superficial gunshot wounds. All that these patients required after we'd assessed them was pain relief and dressings or stitches to their wounds. Admittedly, there were some serious cases. We'd be alerted to them by the sound of a stretcher being wheeled at high speed down the corridor, and my colleague and I would drop whatever we were doing to attend to them. Once we'd stabilized them, we'd then refer them on to secondary and tertiary level hospitals for further management. A few of these cases we couldn't save. One of the patients that we did manage to stabilize was a man in his early 30s. He was brought in at around 3 in the morning with a stab wound to his back. The knife had penetrated quite deeply into the fleshy muscle just below his right shoulder blade, and he bled profusely. Our priority on first seeing him was to stop the bleeding and to rehydrate him. It was particularly important to rehydrate him because he was extremely drunk, so chances are he was already dehydrated before his injury. After we'd stabilized him, I prepared his referral notes, and I made arrangements for an ambulance to take him to a secondary level hospital where he would need to be seen by the surgeons there to repair his wound. I saw other patients after that particular patient, and by morning I was getting ready to go home. That's when I heard him in the room next to mine. He was shouting at one of the nurses and swearing at her. "I've been left here to die," he kept shouting, and he didn't seem to believe her when she told him that he'd already been attended to. So I went to intervene. I tried to talk some sense into him. I even showed him where I'd made my notes in his folder. But he was having none of it. He continued to shout and swear, so I walked away to finish off my handover notes. I'd forgotten all about that patient when I left the hospital later that morning. My mind was on getting home, taking a shower, and going straight to bed. But just as I was driving out of the hospital gates, I saw him again. He was standing across the road trying to wave down a taxi. He wasn't wearing a top, and the dressing that we'd applied to his wound was soaked with blood. He'd clearly just stormed out of the hospital in a huff. My initial instinct was to go to him because he really needed to be in hospital. But I didn't do that. Instead, I sat in my car and watched from a distance. I watched as taxi after taxi passed without stopping, and each time he would shout after it and wave his arms frantically. Eventually, a taxi did stop. He got in, and it drove off. That's when I engaged my gears and resumed my journey home. I remember that scene like it was yesterday, though the reality is it happened more than 10 years ago. But it stands out so vividly in my mind because it represented a moment of clarity after months of confusion and indecision. I knew in that moment that it was time to quit medicine. That's right, I quit. I left clinical medicine and I shut the door firmly behind me. Now, with that kind of start, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this talk is all about death and disease and the dysfunction in our health system. And while those elements are part of my talk today, there's more. Because this is really a talk about what becomes available when we have the courage to let go. It wasn't easy walking away from my profession. I felt shame and guilt for having walked away. I wondered whether I'd been foolish and naive. How could I have spent so long studying and then chosen to leave it all behind? Was it all wasted? I no longer trusted my ability to make important decisions, and I tried to run from it all by working in fields completely unrelated to medicine. But I couldn't hide. The questions kept coming. People wanted to know why I left, and the voice in my own head was getting louder. So towards the end of 2012, I went looking for answers. I did a post-mortem on the premature death of my medical career, and I packaged it in the form of a memoir by the same name. The most obvious place to start this inquiry was with my own story. I was born in the Johannesburg township of Soweto, not far from here. I was the younger of 2 children. My upbringing was fairly typical for a black person growing up in the townships during the 1970s and 80s. This was a very dark time in the history of our country, the dying days of apartheid, and that particular monster wasn't going down without a fight. As I'm sure many of you will remember, there were riots and boycotts, police spraying tear gas, people being shot and imprisoned. And while all of this was going on in my external environment, there was turmoil in my internal world too. My father was an alcoholic, and life at home was often very tense. It felt as if we were always teetering on the verge of collapse. My world nearly did collapse when my brother died when I was 14 years old. So by right, life shouldn't have worked out for me, but it did. I love to learn, and most of all, I love to read. In the middle of my father's rants, I would bury my head in books, and I learned that more was possible for me beyond the stifling confines of my home environment. So I set my sights on the biggest dream I could dare to dream, to be a doctor. And I worked very hard to realize that dream. It was a very proud moment for me when I graduated from University of Cape Town in 1999. But that's where the fairy tale ends. Hellish is probably the best word to describe my experiences during the time that I worked as a doctor in public hospitals. I worked long hours in poorly resourced healthcare facilities, looking after very sick patients. This was the time of AIDS denial in this country, so patients were dying in their numbers. It got to a point, there was a time when I started to wonder whether HIV was some sinister virus that was being targeted at my patients. Everywhere I looked, it seemed as if patients were either infected or dying from complications related to the disease. It got to the point where I just didn't want to know anymore. And it wasn't just that I was constantly giving my patients bad news, but it was also that I then couldn't do anything about it. I was effectively dumping a devastating diagnosis on them and then leaving them to deal with it with whatever supportive measures they had at their disposal. In addition to HIV and other diseases, we were also dealing with war zone type violence in our communities. I don't want to tell you the gory details of the gruesome ways in which people caused each other harm. It causes one to question the kind of society we live in and how little regard there is for the value of human life. So that morning in Khayelitsha, as I sat in my car watching that injured man get into a taxi and drive away, it had all come to a head. I was disillusioned. I thought that my world-class medical training would equip me to deal with the daily challenges I faced. I was traumatized by the horrors I'd seen in the emergency rooms, and I felt impotent to make any real impact in the lives of my patients. It all came together as I watched that man go, and the resounding question in my heart in that moment was, who had I become that I could watch a patient who clearly needed medical attention get into a taxi and drive away? The truth is, I had become someone I didn't recognize, and certainly someone I did not want to be. So I left. And what followed was a process of soul-searching that lasted close to a decade. At first, the soul-searching was characterized by doubt and self-recrimination. Later on, there was more meaningful introspection and reflection. And ultimately, I arrived at an acceptance of myself and the life-changing decision I had made. While interrogating my journey through medicine, I also spoke to other doctors who had chosen to walk away. Their stories were harrowing. Stories of junior doctors working very long hours, taking on too much responsibility with very little supervision from more experienced doctors. There were stories of shortages of medication, equipment, supplies, and of course personnel. Some doctors cracked under the pressure, like Nina, a talented young doctor who suffered a breakdown during her first year as an intern. And Wanda, who told me how she felt she was playing God with people's lives. Another doctor, Ludwe, spoke about what he termed the health disservice in the system. Others simply became disillusioned when they realized that there was a mismatch between what they were taught and what they could practically do on the ground. There was a common thread which ran through all of these stories, one of trauma, overwhelm, and burnout. I was very fortunate that I was able to write about these experiences. It was a cathartic process for me, and it allowed me to bring closure to a very challenging chapter of my life. And thankfully, it's also given rise to a long overdue conversation in the medical fraternity about what's not working in the profession and in the health system as a whole. It's as if my story has broken open a wound that's been festering for years, but wasn't being attended to because no one wanted to admit that it was there in the first place. So at last we are talking about what it's really like, and I believe that we've taken a critical step towards healing healthcare and those who work in it. But while it's all worked out well now, for a long time I gave myself a very rough time about leaving. After all, so many of us were brought up on the notion of perseverance and hanging in there at all costs. No pain, no gain. We've internalized the story to the extent that we won't allow ourselves to let go, even when holding on is sucking every ounce of vitality out of us. And the critical voice doesn't only come from within. I've had people say to me, "How dare you? How dare you walk away from something that so many would give anything for? What right do you have to try to make another life for yourself?" What right do I have? The right to wholeness and fulfillment, to follow my journey wherever it may lead, to stumble and fall and pick myself up and start again. The right to well-being. It's a right we all have as human beings. I would even go as far as to say that it's our responsibility, particularly in the health sector, where the well-being of others is in our hands. That's what becomes available when we choose to stop suffering. Yet, so many remain stuck. There is fear of change, of criticism, of letting others down. What they fail to appreciate is that there is a big difference between letting go of what no longer works and giving up because you just couldn't be bothered. It takes courage to really look at your life and to see when things aren't working, to acknowledge it, to see when you're actually doing more harm than good. It's a powerful act to put your hand up and say, I'm struggling. And when that struggle starts to impact your well-being and the well-being of those you love, and potentially the well-being of those you serve, then it really is time to make some tough decisions. Believe me when I say this, it's not easy when you realize that some dreams must be allowed to die. But out of letting go, something else becomes available. When I chose to walk away from the medical profession, I gave myself a second chance, a chance to thrive instead of suffering, to find and do work that I love, and to contribute and make a difference in my own way. There is so much going on in our world right now that demands our attention. I believe that we must show up to that challenge with passion and commitment. And that means that we must be willing to let go of what no longer serves us and what ultimately prevents us from truly serving others. The world needs us at our best. Thank you.